Welcome back to another edition of the Sitdown with Magnolia Tribune. I'm Russ, Latino, CEO of Magnolia Tribune. Hope you're liking the edition so far. We're on to our third one today. Please give us a like and subscribe. If you're not already following Magnolia Tribune, go to magnoliatribune.com. You can enter your email address there, get our daily email updates. We send over 70,000 Mississippians across the state. You can also follow us on social platforms at Magnolia Tribune. I think we're going to have a very interesting conversation today with Marc Goldwein, who is the Senior Vice President and Senior Policy Advisor at the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. One of the smartest guys I know. If you're not following him on Twitter, you should follow him on Twitter because, he likes math. And it's not a partisan thing. If you look at his analysis, it's very much here's how much the federal government is spending. Here's how much we're taking in. Here are the problems in front of us. So, Marc, welcome with that introduction. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you. Thanks for having me.
Well, look, I have been for a long time following federal spending. Like a lot of policy wonks, we get into it. The average person maybe doesn't always follow it or understand it. When I was born, the national debt hit $1 trillion for the first time. That's 42 years ago. I'm dating myself. In the 42 years since, it's 34x'd. We just crossed over $34 trillion in national debt, and it's accelerating. You look at the first quarter of this fiscal year, the deficit was nearly $500 billion, or a little over $500 billion, I believe, just for a single quarter in the fiscal year. When the average person hears these numbers, they're so big, it seems so surreal that I don't think it means anything to them anymore. It's almost sort of past that line of theater of the absurd. What are the reasons that regular people hearing those numbers should care about the national debt?
Yeah, well, the national debt affects the economy and it affects the federal government's ability to govern. How does it affect the economy? First of all, that high inflation we had over the last couple of years, the high interest rates that you're seeing now on your mortgages and your credit cards, that's in part because of the national debt. When the government issues bonds, basically they're sucking money away from the private sector. People are buying those bonds instead of investing in the private sector. That crowds out investment, reduces economic growth, pushes up interest rates, and if it happens too fast, also pushes up inflation. On top of all of that, the government has to pay for its own debt. It pays interest on its debt. And every dollar it pays on interest is a dollar that it can't be giving you in the form of lower taxes, in the forms of investment of education, national security, you name it. Interest is the single fastest growing part of the federal budget. Last year, we spent more on interest than on kids. In a few years, the interest budget is going to exceed the defense budget. And so the federal government is essentially, wasting money on financing past borrowing when it could be using it for worthwhile causes.
Yeah, so we're on a path to essentially debt service or interest on the national debt that's over $1 trillion a year, right?
Oh, we're pretty close to that. We'll be $1 trillion in a few years. Um, interest is probably going to be the largest federal government program in a quarter century or less.
Yeah, and so it's crazy to think about because you're essentially saying if you spend that dollar on your credit card statement on interest, then you can't spend it, to your point, on kids' education. You can't spend it on infrastructure. You can't spend it on national defense. All of those things weaken us. I find interesting what you said about inflation, because obviously we've been going through this incredible inflationary period of the last several years. And some of that's a byproduct of a supply shock, right? COVID required shutdowns across our economy. It changed the stream of commerce globally with supply chains. But on top of that, you saw this massive influx of cash. And it's sort of the old Milton Friedman formulation, right? That when demand outstrips production, that's when you get inflation. And so you had these two things happening at once: the federal government dumping trillions of new dollars into the system at the same time that you had the supply shock. So talk a little bit more about sort of the cause of inflation right now and how spending relates to
Yeah.
the inflation that people have been experiencing.
I think here's the easiest way to think about it. The economy was only able to produce $20 trillion worth of stuff, but because people had so much money saved up from the pandemic, from all the stimulus checks, from the unemployment, from all the stimulus, because people had so much money, they basically wanted to buy $25 trillion worth of stuff. So people wanted to buy more than was produced. Now, some of that led to a ramp up in production. It was actually probably good for getting unemployment down faster. But there was no way to keep up. And so what did firms do? They raised prices, right? They raised prices on everything. You can draw a straight line from that last round of stimulus checks that families got in 2021, $7,000 for a family of five, straight to the car dealership. People took that check right to the car dealership and all demanded cars at once. That happened the same time there was a chip shortage. But even without that, demand for cars was just so high that the sellers responded by boosting the price. And we saw that throughout the economy. Now that that stimulus is over, we're not still sending people more checks or more unemployment. The interest rates are higher. They were really low then. And the supply chains have cleared. We're seeing inflation come down. Maybe not totally fixed. We don't know yet, but certainly down from its highs of a couple of years ago when there was all that money in the economy.
One of the things that we hear a lot in the States, right? Obviously, DC is its own little enclave. I'm sure you get tired of hearing people say DC is not the real world. But out in the States, you'll hear, particularly in conservative states like Mississippi, you'll hear people rail against federal government spending, right? We want to bring down the national debt. All of this sort of rhetoric that you hear, while simultaneously very much treating federal dollars like manna from heaven and trying to do whatever they can to draw down more federal dollars. As states think about their fiscal positioning and the national debt, what are the cautionary tales or what are the things that they should be concerned about in terms of that spigot that comes from the federal
Yeah.
government?
Well, look, the federal government has always been financing the states, but they did a lot of extra financing over COVID. In fact, we sent state and local governments from the federal level almost $1 trillion in total. If you add together the direct relief to states, the money for K through 12 education, the money for Medicaid, you add all that together, we send the states $1 trillion, and we send it to them at a time that their revenue is surging, in part because of inflation and other factors. And so I think state governments felt like, well, they were flush with cash. They should do big tax cuts. They should do big new paid leave programs or other kinds of spending programs. I would really caution states about taking one-time money from the federal government or one-time surges in your own revenue that you don't know will sustain and making permanent commitments because cutting taxes is fun and easy. Creating new programs, for paid leave or whatever is fun and easy, but reversing that is really tough. So if you come on hard times when the economy's not in as good shape, so your revenue is not as good, where the federal government's not as generous because they're worried about their own deficit, you're going to make tough cuts. And these new shiny programs, new shiny tax cuts probably aren't going to be first on the list. Instead, you're maybe going to have to cut some bone from, teachers that actually you need, or police or things like that. So I would be cautious about taking one-time windfalls from the federal government and assuming they will continue because the federal government is giving you money that it itself has borrowed.
Yeah, so I mean, the one-time money certainly is a concern, right? If you're using one-time money on recurring expenses, that's clearly a budgeting no-no. Lots of states seem to be doing it, but it's also a concern just in the grand scheme when you think of the things that are not one-time, that are recurring. That at some point the federal government might say we're not able to contribute as much as we've been contributing in the past, and then how do you as a state adjust to that? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Because look, when it comes time to budget cutting, when we realize that actually our deficit's out of control, politicians aren't going to want to cut the things where their constituents see a direct benefit, right? They'd rather cut something where it makes somebody else's problem. And so I'm not saying the first place they look, but an early place they may look is state and local funding. And in particular, they may look at where state and local governments getting more than really is intended out of the program. So I'll give you a huge example. The Medicaid program gives every state a matching rate based on their costs. But states have figured out how to manipulate this matching rate. They figured that if they go to a hospital and they say, tell you what, we're going to pay you $5 more, but we're also going to tax you $4.50. The hospital says, that's great. I get an extra 50 cents. And the state says that's great because they get to report to the federal government an extra $5 of costs. They get an extra $3. Everybody's happy except for the feds. That scam has been going on and getting worse for some time. Eventually, the federal government may say enough is enough. This is costing us $100 billion a year. We're going to cut it out.
So as we think through what comes next. I mean, there's conversation in DC right now about the budget. You see a lot of gamesmanship going on about the budget. But at the same time, you've got a bipartisan tax credit increase coming down the pike. And it strikes me that some of the conversation around that has been a little disingenuous. And here's where you and I may disagree a little bit. But I look at the tax relief in the form of a tax credit and say that it's not really a tax relief program. It really is an additional welfare program, at least for the portion of it which is refundable, which means people aren't paying in taxes, but they're getting something back. But even if that wasn't in play, we're talking about essentially an additional tax expenditure by the federal government at a time where deficits are already running $500 billion a quarter.
Well, let me tell you what I think is the good news on this front before I get to the bad news. The good news is that I think that we have turned a corner. From about 2015 to 2022, all politicians did was spend more, deficit financed, and cut taxes, deficit financed. They all did it. Late President Obama did it somewhat. President Trump did it way more. He borrowed. He signed into law $8 trillion of borrowing. And then President Biden did it. He signed into law another 4 or 5 trillion of borrowing. They all did it. Something changed in 2022, late 2022. It started with the Inflation Reduction Act. If you remember, originally, the Democrats wanted like a $6 trillion down to $3 trillion bill that was barely paid for. They ended up with a much smaller bill that at least on paper was paid for. Turns out the numbers weren't quite right, but the principle was there. They pivoted from we're going to do huge deficit finance spending to we're going to do more modest and fully paid for spending. That was the beginning of the pivot. Then we went further when the House Republicans took over with the Fiscal Responsibility Act. President Biden negotiated a deal with Speaker McCarthy at the time to basically not pay for spending increases, but actually cut spending by $1.5 trillion over 10 years by capping discretionary spending. That was our first major deficit reduction since 2011. And then we start talking about these fiscal commissions as new ways to reduce savings. So this is the good news. We've turned the corner. And it's also true in this tax cut package because guess what? They're talking about paying for it. They're about paying for it by getting rid of some sort of fraudulent and excessive payments from the COVID packages, but still they're talking about paying for it. So that's the good news. I think we have started to pivot towards pay for and deficit reduce rather than just borrow, borrow, borrow. Now, here's the bad news. We're not pivoting nearly fast enough, not nearly as fast as our deficit is rising. We're still talking about new tax breaks, right? We should be talking about tax increases, frankly. We're still talking about new welfare and spending programs, to your point. We should be talking about spending cuts. So we are not pivoting fast enough. The deficit last year was $2 trillion. The debt is headed to its largest share of the economy in history, even higher than World War II. Interest is the fastest growing part of the budget. Interest rates are the highest they've been, other than last year, since the early aughts. We should be pivoting to full-on deficit reduction, not just to paying for new kinds of tax cuts and new kinds of spending increases.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's good to hear that people are at least taking first steps, but the acceleration is the scary point to what you're saying. You know, it strikes me as we talk about these issues that a lot of folks don't understand really how the federal budget even works, right? And that there are two buckets, if you will. That bucket, which is discretionary, which is the thing that we fight over so much, and then a much larger bucket of quote unquote mandatory spending that just happens as a course without Congress having to do much of anything. Talk a little bit about those different buckets, how they work, what the risks are in both buckets, if you will.
Yeah. So if you went back to, say, the 1960s, the vast majority of the budget was under the control of the politicians you just elected. Every year, they would decide how much to appropriate for defense, how much to give for education, how much for the interior and commerce. We didn't have EPA or Homeland Security back then, but we had sort of equivalents doing it. They would decide how to allocate the money. That has become an increasingly smaller and smaller share of the budget. It's about a quarter of the budget now that we actually decide every year. The rest of the budget is on autopilot, or it's mostly on autopilot. It's things like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid that are decided by formula that they never have to review, or things like food stamps and welfare that they technically have to renew every 5 or 10 years, but it's usually just kind of a rubber stamp. What's the saying? Um, they usually just give sort of a blank check. They just say, okay, we're going to extend this. And so an increasing share of the budget is on autopilot. Now, this isn't because we've decided, you know what, we're going to shrink one part and we're going to grow the other. It's because most of the programs that are on autopilot are also on autopilot to grow very quickly, especially our health and retirement programs grow way faster than the economy year to year. And so basically, our discretionary spending, the things we decide every year, has kind of stayed flat as a share of the economy. It's shrunk even, it's risen somewhat in real terms, stayed flat as a share of the economy. But the mandatory side, the autopilot stuff, has grown dramatically. And that can explain pretty much the entirety of our deficit.
So, given the fact that mandatory spending is such a big driver, and look, sometimes you hear people use that as an excuse, right? People in Congress will say, well, discretionary spending that we have control over is really only 25% of the budget. So it doesn't really matter what we do with it. I think that's going too far in the argument. But it is true that if you want to get the national debt under control, if you want to reduce deficits, at some point, you've got to be willing to look at mandatory spending. No one is. It's like the third rail of politics. And I think about it in a bipartisan way. It's like the third rail of politics. President Biden's State of the Union last year, one of the big sort of flashpoints was him coming out and saying, well, there are Republicans who want to cut your Social Security and Medicare. And of course, you got the sort of visceral reaction from Republicans in the chamber and then immediate denials, right? No, we would never do that. And now you look at the presidential race, it looks like, for all intents and purposes, we're going to get a rematch of 2020. And you've got former President Trump who's saying, hands off Social Security and Medicare. We're not ever going to touch those things. It strikes me that while I understand the politics of it, it's a really, really irresponsible approach given what we know about the drivers of the national debt. I'm curious what you think.
Yeah. One of the most disappointing things for me in politics is the amount that Social Security and Medicare have been demagogued. Now, this has always been true. There's always been, Social Security's been called the third rail of American politics. We've been talking about Medicare for 40 years, but it's gotten way worse to the point that, as you said, our last two presidents have said they will not touch Social Security and Medicare. This isn't just a problem for the debt, by the way. This is a problem for the programs themselves, because Social Security and the Medicare hospital insurance program are run with their own trust funds, and those trust funds are running out of money. The Medicare trust fund for hospital insurance is 7 years from being out of money. The Social Security trust fund is from 10 years from being out of money. And when those trust funds run out, what it means is you can only pay as much benefits as money's coming in. For Social Security, that means a 25% across the board benefit cut. And I want to illustrate that more specifically, because when you say, I promise not to touch Social Security, what you are endorsing is a $17,400 cut in benefits to a typical couple that retires just 9 years from now. A typical couple that is 58 today, you are saying, I support your benefits being $17,000 lower, because that is the legal consequence of not touching Social Security, not saving Social Security, that across the board cut. You're similarly saying, and I want to reduce your access to Medicare, because Medicare payments would be cut effectively 10%. And do you think that providers are going to keep making payment, keep seeing all their patients for a 10% cut, especially the way that we implement it? And so this is shameful, not just for the budget, but it's shameful if you actually care about Social Security and Medicare beneficiaries. We can't guarantee current beneficiaries full benefits under the law, let alone working Americans or younger Americans. This is a big problem. I also will say we're not getting Social Security and Medicare costs back to what they were in 2000, right? The costs have risen. They've risen in part because we're older. That should be expected. And so even though I think you could look at the situation and you could say the rising cost of mandatory spending can explain the entire problem, it's never going to be all the solution. And so that's why it is really important to look at that remaining 25% of the budget, because some of the money is going to have to come from there. And it's why it is really important to look at the tax code, because some money is going to have to come from there. Knowing the problem isn't the same as knowing what the right solution is.
So it's interesting. I had a conversation with a hospital administrator a couple of months ago, And I brought up the fact that Medicare Part A had an insolvency date that really was not that far away. And I just asked, are hospitals concerned about this at all? And his response to me was, it's not something that we talk about a lot. And once I pressed him on it a little bit, he was like, he just basically said, well, I assume the federal government will make up the difference. But this is a federal government that's already going to be paying $1 trillion on debt service and is accumulating debt at the fastest pace that we've ever seen in our lifetimes. It strikes me that that the thought that the federal government's just going to step in and fill the void, maybe it would for a little while, but eventually that just accelerates the sort of fiscal cliff that we're on, doesn't it?
Yeah. Look, I think it's very possible that we get to that insolvency date. Politicians haven't acted. And so the response is we're just going to borrow. We're going to borrow more. But that's bad for everyone. That's bad because it means even more debt, even more pressure on interest rates, on inflation, on lowering wages, on interest costs. But it's also bad for those programs. Social Security has enjoyed this protected status for its entire history, where it is a contributory program. You pay in and then you get benefits out, right? And that means that we don't use Social Security cuts to pay for an increase in something else or to pay for a tax cut. We say, this is an earned benefit, you've paid in, you get out. Um, Once we start saying that we're going to borrow for some of it, we're going to use general revenue funds for some of it, that's out the table. We've essentially ended Social Security as we know it and created a new program that's funded in part out of your payroll tax, but largely out of more and more borrowing that we know we can't afford.
So, one of the things you hear people say frequently on Social Security, and particularly if you're talking to people who are near the age of retirement or retired, they'll say, well, the program would be fine if the federal government wasn't using the Social Security Trust Fund, right? There's this prevailing, I'll call it a myth, that essentially the trust fund would have had plenty of money in it, but for the fact that the feds raided it.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So the trust fund is kind of an accounting mechanism. It was basically used to take the surpluses Social Security was running in the 90s and early 2000s and hold them to be spent later. There is sort of an argument that politicians did spend that money in the 90s and 2000s. They didn't save it in the sense they used it to pay down the debt. But for accounting purposes, it is all still there. And every number that I've quoted you today assumes that we're getting every dollar back, right? If we weren't getting every dollar back, Social Security would already be insolvent because it's already running a big deficit. The only reason we can make it another 9 years is using that money from the trust fund. And so while from an economic perspective, the trust fund may have encouraged more borrowing, from an accounting perspective, it has had that borrowing's had no effect on Social Security solvency, and Social Security would not be in any better shape had politicians acted differently.
It strikes me as we sit here and talk about this that part of the problem here is not just sort of federal irresponsibility. There's certainly plenty of that to go around, but we also have a shifting population problem in our country. And I know this is not your area of expertise. I'm almost going to go Elon Musk on you here, Mark, and say we need more workers, right? We need if you look at the picture of what it used to look like, workers to Medicare recipients, workers to Social Security recipients, it was plus 10 to 1. And now I think we're down to 2 or 3 to 1. And that balance creates a real problem.
Yeah. So here's an interesting thing. Our fiscal problems are mainly driven by the fact that we are getting older and more people are eligible for Social Security and Medicare, but there's not that much in terms of more workers. Same thing for our economic problems. We used to grow as an economy 3 to 3.5% per year. Now we grow as an economy 1.5 to 2% a year. The majority of that difference is because we're not getting new workers. We're getting an older population. So if we want a stronger budget and a stronger economy, we're going to have to make some adjustments to that ratio. And there's several ways to do it that I would encourage looking at all. One is to look at older workers. It turns out that working longer is great for the economy. It's great for the budget. It's great for people's personal finances because they save more and have less years to draw it down. But it's also, on average, good for people in general. People that work longer as a result, when I say work longer, I don't mean work to 80s. People that work to 68 instead of working to 66, or they work to 66 instead of working to 64, They live longer as a result. They are physically healthier, mentally healthier. They have stronger social networks, more friends. They drink less. They watch less TV. Lower divorce rates because they're not at home annoying their spouse all day. Like on every front, people that work longer end up financially, physically, mentally, socially better off. So one way to address this is to get rid of some of the disincentives to keep working, because it turns out that people retire earlier now than they did in the 60s, despite the fact that jobs are a lot less physically intensive and people live a lot longer now. So that's one area we can look, is older workers. A second area is immigration, right? Bringing more immigrants into the country can help fill jobs that aren't being appropriately filled now, can increase economic growth, and can increase the amount of people paying into Social Security and Medicare. And then we can look at other kinds of marginal workers, working parents, workers with disability, the formerly incarcerated. There's opportunities here to give all those groups of folks the kinds of support they need to be in the workforce. Sometimes that means for them and for the seniors thinking about more flexible arrangements. Not all work should be 9 to 5. People should be able to phase out of retirement or do encore careers. Parents should have, we should be looking for kinds of jobs where you can still drop off your kid and pick up your kid from school. So part of this is about thinking about flexibility. Part of this is about thinking about incentives. Part of this is thinking about the culture. But we're used to a situation where we have just huge amounts of labor supply growth every year. That's no longer the case. We need to adjust.
Yeah, all I know is in human history, no economy has ever had sustained growth without sustained population growth. And so, long term, for us to be successful, I think it's an all of the above type scenario where we do need to be encouraging legal migration into this country, and we need to be thinking differently about how we address these problems. It strikes me in talking about Social Security and Medicare that it's a little bit like standing on a train track, and there's a locomotive coming at you, and your solution to dealing with the fact that the locomotive is coming at you is not to stop the train or step off the track. It's just to turn your back. And that seems like a perilous path to be on. Let's get more current, though. Obviously, there's been this budget scrum going on in DC. Talk a little bit about sort of what the way the process should be working, how the process is working, and what is the fix to
Yeah.
what I think most people see as a broken budget process.
I'll tell you what, the process is a mess, and our obsession over this mess is a distraction. The process is a mess because appropriators we're supposed to, President puts out a budget, Congress puts out their own budget, it passes. That budget sets the framework. It's not actually law, but sets the framework for what to do next. Then appropriators are supposed to appropriate 12 bills. The other committees are supposed to make any changes to tax revenue or spending consistent with that budget, mandatory spending. And then we do the whole thing over again, and we do it in a responsible way. Here's what actually happens. President puts out a budget late. It's dead in arrival. It often has a lot of phony numbers, and nobody cares about it. Congress either doesn't do a budget, does a budget only to get some fast track processes, or starts a budget but doesn't get anywhere. The appropriators don't get their act together. We do a continuing resolution that's just sort of like an extending the deadline. We do another deadline extension. We flirt with shutdowns. Sometimes we have government shutdowns. And then eventually we do a big omnibus bill that not only funds the government for another year, but also throws in various spending increases and tax cuts that didn't go through the normal committee process, but they're just trying to put under the, sneak in to the process. It's completely broken. We miss all the deadlines. We focus entirely on this tiny share of a budget. We fight and bicker over the dumbest stuff. And we don't budget. I wish I knew there was one solution. We have a project called the Better Budget Initiative, I think it's called, that we've tried to come up with some ideas, both large and small, to improve the process. But at the end of the day, what you need is politicians that actually want to budget. And part of that comes from they need to understand that there's a cost to not having discipline. In state and local governments, you have to budget, right? Because you got to figure out each year how you're going to allocate your money, and it's got to match at least your expected revenue. That's not true at the federal level. It's kind of optional, and that's ridiculous.
Yeah, it strikes me that they create their own doomsday scenarios in part because that's how you get to spend more money.
Yeah.
Right? It gives leverage when you're right up against a deadline and you've got to do CRs until the cows come home. And, at some point you're hanging out with the threat of default or government shutdowns, and those things always backfire. So that the process has been played in a way that ultimately leads to really bad compromise because the result of not having that bad compromise at the 12th hour or sometimes past the 12th hour is government shutdown and then the threat of default, which is why part of me is sympathetic to some of the more hardline folks. But by the same token, that's not a solution either, because what happens is, let's say we had another government shutdown, 2 months from now, or a month from now, or 2 weeks from now, it's going to end.
Yeah,
And
and it doesn't solve anything because the government shutdown doesn't deal with Medicare, doesn't deal with Medicaid, doesn't deal with the tax expenditures and tax breaks, right? So, it's just not a solution. I do appreciate that they, didn't put the deadline at the end of December, because that's when the politicians really want to do stuff because they want to get home for Christmas. And I think it was actually helpful that they split up the bills because it reduces the likelihood that there's going to be this gigantic package. But at the end of the day, those are kind of window dressing. They're not solving the real problem, which is we're not budgeting.
any final closing thoughts or words of wisdom?
Well, our debt is out of control. Our major trust funds are headed towards insolvency. We have both political parties promising not to do things instead of promising to do things. We need a total 360 here. We've started to turn that corner, but we're nowhere near enough. And that's going to mean that people are going to have to accept things they don't like. It means taxes are going to go up or tax breaks are going to be cut. It means benefits are going to go down. There's a lot we can do to save money in healthcare that lowers costs without lowering sort of access or value of care, but we're probably going to go further than that even. And it means that all these government services that we're used to getting more and more of each year, it's just not going to be. The fact is, we're spending more than we can afford. And if we don't close that gap, um, people are going to see it at the grocery store and in their paychecks. And that's a really unfair way to finance our debt on the back of working Americans.
A call to sacrifice is a tough call, but a necessary one. We've been talking with Marc Goldwein, Senior Vice President, Senior Policy Advisor of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. He does great work. They do great work. Truly one of the more bipartisan organizations in DC, based on my experience with you guys. Appreciate your time, Marc.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's been another edition of the Sit Down with Magnolia Tribune. Please give us a like and subscribe. Please visit us at magnoliatribune.com. Sign up for our newsletter. Over 70,000 Mississippians are getting it daily. We're glad to have you on this edition. Hope you're doing well.